Welcome to the first officer training session for Crossroads Presbyterian Church. Let's begin from the beginning. Today, in today's training, we are going to be learning a little bit more about what it means to serve in an ordered ministry or as a deacon or an elder in the church. So you can see there will be a little bit of everything today. So the question to begin with, though, is why training? Why do we need to be trained to serve as an elder or a deacon? What is it that I, as Pastor Lindsay, and the session here at Crossroads hope to accomplish in these training sessions? Well, why we train is because we are required to, by the Presbyterian Church USA, to provide training for the ordered ministries of deacon and elder. And that training must be sufficient and examined by the session that is required by the Book of Order. Exactly what that training is open for debate. Excuse me. And personally, as your pastor and as the moderator of session, it is my hope to equip you for whatever being an elder or a deacon might throw at you during your time in service. And we know that that's impossible to prepare for every scenario, especially people who've lived through a pandemic. But what I hope also is that even if you don't know exactly what to do, you know what resources are available to you and who to ask your questions to when you're unsure. And through that, I hope that you'll experience the movement of the Spirit and a sense of accomplishment in your ministry as a deacon or an elder. So first, what is an ordered ministry? Well, ordered ministry is something we find in the Book of Order, and they are positions in the church that a person is ordained to do. There are only 3 ordered ministry positions in the Presbyterian Church USA. They are ruling elders or members of the session, deacons, and ministers of word and sacrament or pastors. You might be thinking to yourself, but Pastor Lindsay, we have all these other officers in our church. We have trustees. We have members of the preschool and cemetery boards. We have the auditing committee. Aren't those ordered ministries of the church? Well, they're not, actually. They are officers of our church. The trustees oversee the corporate business of the church, and the cemetery and the preschool do their own things with their boards. They are officers of the church. They are important. They are commissioned rules of our church, but they are not ordained and installed to those positions in the same way that elders and deacons are. So in the PCUSA, we believe that, quote, ordered ministries are gifts to the church to order its life so that the ministry of the whole people of God may flourish. So that the whole people of God may flourish. Ordered ministries, elders and deacons and ministers of word and sacrament are elected by the congregation, which we did in June. And I want to remind you that God's grace is sufficient for your call. The Book of Order says, in addition to possessing the necessary gifts and abilities, those who undertake particular ministries should be persons of strong faith, dedicated discipleship, and love of Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. It does not say that you need to be perfect or more sacred and holy than everybody else. It doesn't say that you should make no mistakes or that you need to have experience in or training in particular ways. It just simply says that you need to have faith and that God will provide what you need to do your ministry. So I guarantee you that at some point in your time as an elder or a deacon, you will ask the question, God, why did you call me to serve in this role? Do I have what it takes to serve in this role? And I can assure you that God's grace is sufficient for your calling. Elders and deacons and pastors are ordained for life. So you only have to be ordained one time to any particular ministry, although you would be ordained if you have previously been ordained as a deacon, but you're elected to serve as an elder, you would then be ordained as an elder as well. But you only need to be ordained once to each of the 3 ordered ministries. And you're ordained for life. So you'll always be an ordained elder or deacon or pastor in the PCUSA. However, we are elected by the congregation to serve for a particular term of service, which in this case is 3 years. Unless you're taking over a vacancy spot, in which case it is whatever it is. So a term of service is 3 years. Now, in our church, a lot of times people talk about re-upping. So they'll talk about if someone is elected to serve a 3-year term, we just sort of assume that they'll re-up for another term after that so that you serve 6 years at a time. But that is not automatic. After 3 years, you have to be nominated to and elected to that service again in order to serve a consecutive next term. In Pittsburgh Presbyterian and in the PCUSA, you may not serve more than 2 full terms in a row, so more than 6 years in a row. So even if you, for example, were elected to take over a vacancy and you served 2 years of that term, you could serve another full term, 5 years, but you couldn't serve another full term after that. It is no more than 6 years in a row. And so you have to take some time off if you're going to continue to serve in another time. But it's important for us to remember that you're specifically elected to serve for 3 years of time, and you're installed to that particular role for those 3 years. First, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a ruling elder. Ruling elders are the members of session, and they are first and foremost spiritual leaders of the congregation. You might think first and foremost is the second bullet point, which says governing body of the congregation. But the truth is, ruling elders are first and foremost the spiritual leaders of the congregation. Congregations should elect persons of wisdom and maturity of faith, having demonstrated skills in leadership and being compassionate in spirit. Ruling elders are required to care for the worship and the spiritual care of their congregation members. They should exercise good stewardship of their leadership of the congregation, and caring for their own personal faith and praying for the congregation comes first. Ruling elders and all elected people in our congregation, actually all people, should feel that they can vote with a freedom of conscience. Your job is not to vote for the most popular idea, which is what we would think of in our United States government, but to vote where you feel God is leading. So even if you know 30 people who think that we should paint the walls of the hallway purple, and you walk in and they've all told you, vote for this motion to paint our hallways purple. But in your heart, you're like, no, they need to be red. Then you vote for red. You vote the way that your faith is calling you to vote. And session, of course, is the governing body of the congregation. Nothing can happen in this church without it being approved by the session. Second, we have deacons. Deacons are the ministry of compassion and service. They are the right arm of the pastor. The Book of Order says that the ministry of deacon, as set forth in Scripture, is one of compassion, witness, and service, sharing in the redeeming love of Jesus Christ for the poor, the hungry, the sick, the lost, the friendless, the oppressed, those burdened by unjust policies or structures, or anyone in distress. It's a pretty vague definition. Deacons are required to care. They're required to have compassion and to express care, whether that is through a pastoral care type role or through a missional type role or through a fellowship type role. Deacons are called to that mission of compassion and service. However, That is very confusing, because the truth is deacons could have anything thrown into that bucket, right? Pretty much anything we do in the church is out of compassion and service. And so often in many churches, deacons end up taking on more than they can actually handle. And over the past few years here at Crossroads, we've been in a process of determining what direction we'd like the deacons to go. Where do we want the deacons to focus their time and attention? We're slowly figuring that out. There's some things we've taken off their plate and some things we've put on, but we're still working on it. The primary thing that we have been focusing on here at Crossroads is for the deacons to provide some pastoral care, to provide phone calls and visits and cards to our homebound members, to keep a list of folks that we're keeping an eye on who are in particular need of our prayers, and to provide, those types of prayer and service to our congregation members. They have a couple of little mission projects. We have the Gift of the Fourth Wise Men, and once there was a feeding ministry that was a part of the deacons, but those are still sort of, those are a smaller portion of what the deacons overall are here to accomplish. All that to say, if you have ideas of the direction that the deacons should go as you serve on the deacons, we want to hear those, because we are just imagining what the deacons can be in the future. On the day when you are ordained and installed as in your particular role as an elder or a deacon, you will make what is called ordination vows. There are 8 questions that are asked of you, and there are 9 questions. 8 of those questions are asked the exact same way for elders, deacons, and pastors. There's a 9th question that is specific to each role. So there's one for elders, one for deacons, and one for the pastor. And these ordination vows can be found in the Book of Common Worship and also the Book of Order. And so I will give you a copy of them. In fact, you'll get a copy of this entire PowerPoint, but I won't insult your intelligence by reading these out loud. But we are in our trainings going to be talking a little bit about what these ordination vows look like in action. And so here they are. So the next question you might have is, how does this church work? What is the operating structure of Crossroads Presbyterian Church and of the Presbyterian Church as a whole? Something you might not know is that the Presbyterian Church USA is Presbyterian not just simply because of like what we believe about God, but what we believe about governance and our structure of governing. Presbyterian, the word actually means to be governed by presbyters or elders. And so our way of doing business with one another, our system of having a session that is elected by the people to make decisions on behalf of the congregation, is foundational to who we are. The Presbyterian Church USA has 2 books in its constitution. The first one is called the Book of Confessions. This is it. It's kind of fat. The Book of Confessions includes a number of statements of faith over time that begins with the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed and goes all the way to the 1980s and 90s when the Confession of Belhar is written, right? So it's ways that we have learned to understand our faith through the movement of the Holy Spirit over the past 2,000 years, really. Some of them are far more associated with being Presbyterian than others, right? Almost all Christians believe in the Apostles' Creed, but we have a few that are specifically just Presbyterian. The other half of our Constitution is called the Book of Order. It is much skinnier, but it is all of our rules. And so in it, you'll find information about how a session is formed, what is required of a congregation, how does someone become a member, what should be included in any worship service that occurs, what happens when you break the rules, what church discipline looks like. That's what's included in the Book of Order. The Book of Order is revised every 2 years when the National General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA meets. So, but because of the pandemic, this one, which is the current Book of Order, is good from 2019 through 2023, which is unusual. It's usually 2 years. But this is good through 2023 because of the pandemic. We made no changes during the pandemic. The General Assembly did meet this year in 2022, and so we can expect a new edition of this to come out in 2023. I will also tell you it has no really major substantive changes. You can purchase these 2 books from the PCUSA store online, or you can download a free PDF version of them that you can keep on your computer or iPad or whatever. But I recommend that you gain access to those as you serve as an officer of the church, because we as Crossroads are governed by the PCUSA Constitution. There are 2 other documents that are specific to our congregation here at Crossroads that are important for us to remember. One is our bylaws. Bylaws are part of the foundational material for the organization of a congregation. So back in the 1700s, when Crossroads was formed, the group of people that came together created the Articles of, I always get this wrong because it's not the Articles of Confederation, but the Articles, and they are the foundation of our bylaws. They're actually handwritten, and a copy of them lives at the Allegheny County Courthouse. The bylaws take those and then they create this foundational material, this sort of bird's eye view for the rule of life of the congregation, including like how many people serve on the session, how many people does it take to, like how do you vote, how much of the congregation needs to vote yes for something to happen, different things like that. Back in 2012, we went from having a really thick Book of Order to a really thin one, and the Presbyterian Church USA saying every church should come up with its own bylaws to make sure that their governance is correct. So one of the things that has to be in a bylaws is that you can have either hybrid or online meetings, something that almost nobody had until the pandemic, of course. And so you'll remember that back in February at our annual meeting, we changed our bylaws to include rules about how to have a congregational meeting, either hybrid or online. So it's a reminder that bylaws can only be changed through a congregational vote. A couple of years ago, Crossroads changed its bylaws so that to change the size of its session and deacons and trustees. So you can see that in action. We currently have a committee that is working on editing the bylaws and getting them more accurate to how we're actually operating as a congregation. But basically, we want the bylaws to be as not specific as possible because they take a lot of effort to change when they're not working for us. The other document that we operate under is called the Manual of Operations or the Administrative Manual. All manuals of operations, they're required of congregations, and congregations are also required to include a sexual misconduct policy as a part of that administrative manual. The administrative manual includes more minutia than the bylaws, like a mission for each committee, like what does each committee do, and the personnel manual and the safe church policy and a funeral policy. So like all these little elements put together. And a manual of operations or an administrative manual can be changed through the vote of a session. So they're like way easier to change and all of that. Both of those documents are in editing processes because the pandemic changed everything. And as we've changed and lived and grown and done things, we still have a lot of work to do in making sure that what our documents say reflects what we really can do as a congregation. But ultimately, all of those things govern us, and copies of those can be obtained in the office. to give you a basic overview of who does what and who reports to whom, the easy answer is that session governs all of us, and we all report back to session, including the deacons, including the trustees. The deacons and the trustees are boards. They are not committees. So the deacons operate sort of differently, and the trustees, who are responsible for the corporate business of the church, operate differently, but they both report back to the session, and the session should report back to both of them. The committees of the church include worship and music, mission and outreach, Christian ed, personnel, and finance. These have been changed a little bit from the past, but the basic function of the committee is to do some of the work of examining a motion before it comes to session, and to help the different ministries of the church operate decently and in order. Additionally, you'll find the staff who are hired by the church. They're hired by the session, and they're fired by the session. I, as the pastor, serve as the head of staff, and so I operate as their direct supervisor, but I govern them in conjunction with the personnel committee and the session. There are some other boards in our congregation, including the cemetery board, the preschool board, and the audit committee. The cemetery functions very separately from the church, even though that we are united as entities and operate under the same insurance policy. The cemetery board should be giving us regular reports about their work, and the same goes for us to them. The preschool board, preschool is a ministry of this congregation, but they operate as a separate entity for tax-related purposes. And we maintain a covenant between the preschool and the session. So there's a covenant that needs to be reviewed and voted on annually between those two entities. The audit committee is a group of people that annually reviews our financials, and they are also officers of the church. So here's a good question. If I want to do something in the world, who do I contact for what? If you have something that you want to communicate to the congregation, be it through the bulletin, the verbal announcement, a minute for mission, the epistle, the newsletter, or connections, if you want to put it on the website, contact Chrissy. Chrissy Newmeyer is the finance and communications assistant here on our staff. And she is sort of the spider who sends the information out into the different various parts of the web here. So we've got lots of different ways of communicating information, and Chrissy is the one who can utilize all of those. That said, she really needs to get that information in advance when it's possible, because that gives her the opportunity to organize and get things going. The deadlines for getting something in the bulletin or epistle is like the Wednesday before those things happen. The deadline for connections is always the 15th of the month. I would be mindful of holidays and vacation schedules. We try to get that information out as much as possible. And announcements, we try to run them for about 4 weeks at a time, or they start to get stale and people stop reading them. So if you're thinking about, but we also don't want to do it like the day of. So if you're thinking, my committee is going to have a bingo on October 10th, we would like you to get that information to us, at least 4 weeks before it starts, so that people can make plans to attend your event. If you have questions about financial information, about the budget for your particular committee, or for the deacons, or you have questions about stewardship, contact Dominic. He's our church treasurer. If you want financial information, like how much have I given this year, or the budget for your committee, you can also contact Chrissy, who does some of that financial work as well. For items regarding our Christian education for children and youth, including safe church questions, contact Ben. For items regarding music, including choirs or Sunday morning music, you'll want to contact Debbie Broker. For items regarding the church building, so if you're like concerned about lights that aren't functioning or something like that, you would want to contact DJ Zappa, who is the current president of our trustees. And finally, if you have any questions about congregational care or you want to bring a prayer concern forward, you would contact me, Pastor Lindsay, or Betsy Hughes, who's the current moderator of the Deacons. The church calendar is kept by Chrissy. So like I said, if you want to schedule an event, you want to do it as soon as possible. And you want to contact Chrissy, who can let you know if a room is available or things are happening simultaneously to it. We keep our calendar on a Google Calendar, which is maintained by Chrissy alone, so you can't just log in and do it. And it should always be on our church website, although sometimes that's tricky getting it up there. You can also ask Chrissy for a link to send you a link in your email that you can click on to download that to your phone or your computer. That might be beyond you, and that is okay. There are printed copies available in the front office, and we do post the meeting schedules on the whiteboard when you walk into the door from the outside. We are actually in the process of transitioning that whiteboard into a TV that's going to just show you the Google Calendar, which will be fabulous, but stay tuned, that's still coming. So if you want a date for something for the deacons or for your committee or for whatever, and there's already something scheduled, the staff meetings are used to help figure out those conflicts. And we also sometimes bring conflicts like that to the session. This year, we're going to be having a calendaring meeting as a session, or as heads of committees, to look ahead and think through how our calendar looks, and if we're like front-ending things. So we don't want to put every cool thing that's happening at the church on October 5th, right? We want it to be spread out so that people have a continuous connection to the church. A couple of things for the calendar that require session approval. If there's an outside group that's meeting in the church that has never met or been approved in the past. So let's say you personally have a sewing group that's not connected to the church that you'd like to meet at the church, that requires session approval. Events that involve the collection of money. So let's say your committee wants to do a fundraiser for, orphans in Africa, and you decide to do this fundraiser. You need to have that approved by session because they're collecting money. If you want to calendar a new event that has never happened before, so you have this brilliant idea of, this youth event where we're going to go to the trampoline park, but we've never gone trampolining before, that also needs to be approved by session. Every time the sacraments are observed, the session has to approve that. So anytime we have communion and anytime we have baptism, those things need to be approved by session. And then if we have special worship services, those need to be approved by session as well. So the calendar for Christmas Eve services, or a wedding or a funeral that happens at the church. So decision making, how a bill becomes a law in the Presbyterian Church. A basic overview. Now this overview has specifics to the session, but this would also be true of the deacons as well. It's just that then those decisions are communicated to the session at the end. So a motion is made by a member of session, the motion is seconded, and then discussion is had by the session. If the discussion for whatever reason needs to be confidential, the session can make a motion to go to executive session. And so anyone who's not a member of session would then have to step out, which isn't something that normally happens around here, but it's possible. And the minutes would then be kept in a sealed envelope. They would be private for that portion of the meeting. The only time we really need to go to executive session is in a matter of personnel where it's really sticky, for example. If more information is needed, the motion is tabled, and then further information can be obtained. So for example, when a motion comes forward, it can be approved, or it can be tabled or sent back to committee for more conversation. Or it can be, we can vote no. If the session is ready to vote, the moderator calls for a vote. Voting can happen either verbally, or we could do paper ballots. It'd be a little crazy, but we could do paper ballots. Motions, generally speaking, are passed by a majority vote. And the moderator, which is me, when they're called and installed, have the right to vote. So an interim pastor does not have the right to vote, but a called and installed pastor does. If the vote is not unanimous, individuals whose vote is in the minority are allowed to submit a dissent opinion. So if you just don't like the decision that's been made, you can submit a written dissent, so that can be put into the public meeting minutes. Now, one thing I need to note is that we must always have a quorum to be able to vote. And our bylaws indicate that a quorum is 5 out of 9, or more than 50% of the voting members of that particular board must be present in order to do business. So if you have fewer than that, you can talk, but you can't make any decisions. There we go. So let me just go through a scenario here. Susie Q thinks that Christmas Eve worship services are too crowded. So she thinks it would be a great idea to add a worship service. While you're at it, Susie Q says it should be contemporary and include communion. How might we process a suggestion like this? Well, the worship and music committee would review this request and consider all the details, like, whatever. Since this adds time to the personnel, they might also send it to the personnel committee, who would have a conversation about whether this was a good investment of our staff time. The worship and music committee would prepare a motion for session to consider, and then it would be sent to them, and it might go on the consent agenda, which we'll talk more about at our session meetings. And then when a motion comes from a committee, it doesn't require a second. And that's because a motion or a committee is multiple voices. So when a committee makes a motion, we know that a lot of different voices have had their eyes and mouths and ears on whatever topic is being discussed. And so when the session receives it, doesn't need a second. Like I said, we'll talk about the consent agenda when we get there, when we go to the session meetings. Once the motion is made and seconded, there is opportunity for discussion. Normally, we want to start talking about it before the motion has been made or seconded, but we really try to wait until the motion is made and seconded, and then there's opportunity for conversation about whether we like it or not. Technically speaking, someone would speak for the motion and then balanced by someone who speaks against the motion. Typically, we do this a little bit more informally, unless there's a particularly contentious motion on the table. Once discussion is complete, the moderator will call for a vote, and the motion can be voted on and actions can be taken. I'm going to skip the second option, but the second option was just basically a motion can come not just from a committee, but from an individual who would bring it forward during new business. So this is the end of our time with this section of the officer training. Just a small snippet of what you'll be able to expect. As always, if you have any questions about what you've learned today, or would like to have further conversation about your specific role in the ordered ministries, please don't hesitate to call my cell phone or shoot me an email. And I will be emailing all of you these slides as well as some other notes along with this video. So thank you again for your service in this ministry. I am looking forward to the ways that God is moving in you and in us as a team. Take care.